safe spaces. Safe spaces, as a soldier, I think safe spaces as behind physical cover, some place where you can't be shot, not some place where you don't have to listen to something that you disagree with. It's a vastly different concept of safe space. I think actually, as defined these days, a safe space is probably a dangerous space, because it's a space where you're isolating yourself from other points of view. And that is, being locked up with your own preconceptions is probably the most dangerous thing in the world.
I mean, this is so key to a lot of the problems that I feel I observe today, is that people are so safe in their opinion.
In their bubble, right.
And actually that creating the bubble is such a lucrative business. Helping, in media,
I think social media has a lot to do with that, because you're basically having conversations without people. You're getting all of this opinion and information without looking someone in the eye and engaging with them. And it's through that open, and when I say open, it means face-to-face exchange of ideas, human to human, where understanding develops and where reconciliation takes place. There are a number of stories out there about soldiers and commanders from Vietnam having gone back to Vietnam 30, 40 years later, and having found the people on the other side and actually engaging with them in human terms and realizing that they're not very different and maybe have more in common with each other than with the people in their respective societies. But there was a point in time when they were enemies directed and willing to kill each other. And, I think that if they can do it face to face, then maybe we're missing an opportunity on social media.
Thank you for taking the time on a Sunday and to agree to this interview. We met half a year ago in
Christmas time.
Christmas time, chanced event. We were both invited, and it was a very how would I say, fruitful dinner party.
Yeah.
And we got to have coffee and lunch together a few weeks later. And the story that you told me was, I would say, inspiring, even though you seem to have disagreed.
Well, it's not that I disagree. It's just, my life out here has been a series of unplanned events.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just spooled out over 35, 40 years.
Right. And so this program, if you ask, we call it life experience.
Okay.
I think we are now living in a world that's changing so quickly. A lot of our peers or even our juniors growing up are quite uncertain about what would their life turn out to be. I think the best answer or best reference to that is people who have lived a intense life, I would say.
Yeah.
So this program is called Life Experience, and I invite people from various tracks of life sharing their life experience.
Happy to do it with all the normal disclaimers, because I think as I get older, the thing that has become apparent to me is that I'm not at all sure that the life I've lived and the times in which I've lived have been normal. I think it all may be a bit of an anomaly, and that maybe what we're seeing is a return to what has been more normal through the course of human history.
Okay.
The chaos, the entropy.
Right.
Not sure.
So in that sentence, basically you're saying you were in that longest period of peace.
The post-war baby boomer lifespan, where people were looking at high single-digit returns on investment and a peaceful, globalizing world. And that was all predicated on the order that emerged from World War II. And I think that we're out at the limit of that order at this point. And it remains to be seen where we go from here.
Right. So, if you don't mind, would you introduce yourself?
Okay. Well, my name is Jeff Clemente, and I'm an American of Italian extraction, raised in the suburbs of New York City, New Jersey, in what I had always thought was a normal American suburban community. What I've realized since I've been in Japan, and that's about 30 years now, is that my upbringing, my family culture, was much more ethnic than I realized. While I don't think we were focused on Italian identity in those days, certainly it permeated everything. Your diet, your habits, your culture, the way your family operated. So that once I got to Japan, I have found myself more gravitating more toward the Italian community here than the American community, which is much larger and much more diverse.
Would you mind sharing how your family ended up in suburban America from Italy?
Well, some of my grandparents were born immediately after their parents had come to the U.S., and two of my grandparents were born in Italy and came as teenagers to the United States. And they clustered in the Italian communities around New York and Philadelphia. New Jersey's sort of a little plug in the middle between those two major cities. They were poorly educated, but worked hard, and on both sides sent their children. On each side there were three. Sent their children to university and to graduate schools, many of them winding up in the professions. So we were, in that sense, one generation removed from the immigration, but it was still very fresh in everybody's mind, and the necessity to assimilate and to become, in every sense, American in those days, rather than hyphenated American, was critical. We really didn't think in those ways. It was all football and rock and roll and all of the things that high school kids were focused on in the 60s. And America was at its relative peak of power at that point. It was the only survivor, basically, of World War II. It had taken its share of casualties, but hadn't borne any of the battle, unlike Europe and Russia and Japan. And so the 50s and 60s in the U.S. were a period when you didn't think about the limits of geopolitical power. You never really thought about power at all. It was just the way the world was.
And that whole story, until we met in Japan, I knew you as a lawyer practicing in between Japanese and international laws, and have a background that is quite unusual. What brought you to Japan in the first place?
The U.S. Army. I was I graduated from high school in 1966. We had a war in Vietnam. We had conscription in the United States that had continued through World War II, through the Korean War, and was still a very significant feature of young American life until 1972, when it ended conscription. And by 1972, I was already in the military. Maybe it was 74 when it ended. But so I came out of high school, and like most people my age, applied to college with the intention of doing that for the next 4 years. Gap years weren't an option, because if you took a gap year, you'd be drafted, and your gap year would be Vietnam or somewhere else for the U.S. Army. So I did that, and then when I finished in 1970, things had moved on, but we were still at it in Vietnam. So I began to think seriously about how to manage my military obligation with my career aspirations. So I went to graduate school, stayed at Cornell, where I'd done my undergraduate, went to the business school, and enrolled in what in the United States we call ROTC, which is Reserve Officer Training Corps, and did that for 2 years while I was in graduate school. And in 1972, as I was graduating, I was commissioned in the Army, and took my first assignment to Washington, D.C., in a health services data systems agency, which didn't like much. I did that, went to a few military schools, as everybody had to, and decided that I was interested in logistics. Went to medical supply course, and then was looking for another assignment. And by that time, I had had quite enough of Washington, D.C., and asked the detailer to send me to Asia, which had been a matter of interest to me. I was pretty ignorant about it. He came back 2 or 3 days later, and he said, Okinawa. And I said, where's that? And he said, well, as of a couple of months ago, it's back in Japan. I said, I'll take it. And that's really as much as I knew. So I came out, did my 2 years down there, became very interested in Japan and Asia, got off active duty, went to law school, stayed in the U.S. Army Reserves through law school, because what I had found is that after being concerned about it for the 6 years that I was in college and graduate school, once I got into it, I began to appreciate the importance and the value of military service, not just for the country, but for the individuals involved, yourself, and the kids with whom you're working, many of whom, because of the draft, are from backgrounds that were hardly privileged. And so I found that extremely rewarding, and decided to stay in it as I pursued my professional career.
How, what's your peers and when you were in the military? Because you, as you described, are highly educated. You're probably more educated in a very prestigious institution. When you are in the military, how does that play out?
You don't think about it much. I mean, in the military culture of the time, even if you were from an elite university, you weren't from the military academies. So you're not perceived as elite. The graduates of West Point, Annapolis, the Air Force Academy, are in military culture the elite.
I see.
I came out of Cornell with what they call a distinguished military graduate, and I received the same type of commission that you received coming out of West Point, which was, in those days, a regular Army commission was different than a reserve commission. And so I held that while I was on active duty. Actually getting rid of it was difficult when I decided that I wanted to go to law school. I wanted to transition from the regular Army to the reserves, and that wound up being a bit of a research project. But actually in August of '75, when I got off active duty, I switched commissions from regular to reserve and went to law school in September.
So I'm quite interested about that spontaneous or kind of idiosyncratic decision to go to Okinawa, a place you didn't know about. How did that play out?
Well, I mean, given my military specialty, it was as close as I could get quickly to the focal point in Vietnam at that point. And I think that there was a transition for me in my perspective. I think during the time that I was in ROTC in graduate school and then went on active duty, where as an undergraduate, I had my doubts about Vietnam, as everybody did. But the change for me was, I think, in my mind, a separation of your civic duty to the country from your position or thoughts about the geopolitics of what was going down. I mean, I think that a lot of people of my age in the late 60s, early 70s, because they disagreed with Vietnam, the geopolitical position in Vietnam, refused or resisted service to the country, and I don't think that helps. I think that things like that can only be addressed from inside the system, not outside the system. And so you come into it with your perspectives, try to understand the perspectives of the other side, and try to influence it and direct it as best you can. And it's, I think you're beginning to see it again today too. Political positions are eroding the way people feel about the country and their duty to it. And I think that that's troublesome.
That's rare, isn't it? It's quite rare. Most people, if I don't disagree with a particular agenda, I choose to stay out of it. Your path is like, I don't fully agree. I'll go inside it and see what I can do about it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, in my case, at least in the early days of that decision cycle, I had the conscription at my back, so it was going to happen one way or another,
right?
Or I was going to leave the country, which never crossed my mind. So by the time I actually got into it, conscription had been replaced by the volunteer army, which at the time I thought was a good idea. Today, I don't think it's such a good idea. I think we've learned a lot. Well, actually, we've seen a lot. I don't think we've learned yet about the moral hazard of being able to commit military power without political accountability.
This sentence alone is extremely loaded in some ways. It's about the...
Well, it is. I mean, I think, because of the existence of the draft through my young years, there was political accountability for what the nation was doing in Vietnam. And, you know, it brought Johnson down. It shaped the politics that followed. It shaped the opening to China and ending the war, because ending the war became an imperative. Public opinion, because of the draft, had shifted, and the politicians were reacting to that.
Just for the general audience to understand this, who may or may not be so familiar with the U.S., basically the draft makes everyday families, children, have to join the army, and for that,
I mean, of course, there are exceptions, but the basic rule is that everyone of a certain age serves for a specified period of time or longer, and the exceptions are narrowly drawn to make it as fair as possible. Toward the end of that, in the U.S., they went to what was called the lottery system and eliminated a lot of the exceptions, which pressurized the system in a different way. It introduced an element of chance to it.
But now you think that this system allowed the decision of war to become a matter of everybody?
It was. It was. In World War II, it was. And through Vietnam, it was. Since the abolition of conscription and the movement toward a volunteer and reserve force, it's allowed politicians from both parties, the Democrats as well as Republicans, to commit American power, American force, without political accountability. And the burden of that falls largely upon the 4 or 5% of the American public that is either serving or has sons or daughters or husbands or wives serving.
Coming from 100% to 5%.
Well, that's right. You know, I mean, I think that, you know, the message of George Bush during the long war on terror was, you know, show that life in the United States hasn't changed. Take your family out, go to the mall. And meanwhile, we have forces committed overseas, you know, and that's, I'm not sure that that's healthy.
And the system has changed since 75, and you remained in the military to today, as far as I understand.
Well, I'm retired. I'm still on the retired list. I served for as long as I could serve under the laws in place at that time. I think it's an important job, and it's too important job for the people who are capable of doing it best not to do it. You know, I mean, and you know, one of my sons who had the capacity to do it, and I told him, if not you, who? You know, it's really important, and we need our best and our brightest.
This is important
to do it.
Is it important for the U.S.? Is it important for?
It's important for every country, I think. Its best and its brightest ought to be involved in doing that and trying to shape and execute the policy in accordance with the rules of international law and their conscience and the law of their country. You know, I mean, look at Israel today. I mean, it's a good example of a country that is fully mobilized after a horrific attack. And, you know, they're doing what they have to do against a background of considerable criticism in every quarter. But, you know, it's a matter of developing a national consensus of what needs to be done to literally save the country, and then getting everybody to agree with respect to what the implementation of that is going to be. You know, and you've got a not particularly popular government over there, but in a time of national peril, the country has put aside its political differences for now and mobilized. And that's, I think it's a small country, and I think it's under great threat, and it's a great threat that everybody understands. And so I think it's fairly easy to develop the type of consensus in the United States, which, thank God, hasn't faced an existential threat for a long time. It's a little more difficult to develop consensus. Japan is an interesting case, because Japan, well, it hasn't really been threatened since the end of World War II. It's close to a lot of instability, and I think that you've seen consensus build here rather rapidly in the last few years, that it needs to pay a little more attention to defense.
And you spent most of your career in Japan.
I have.
Yes.
I have. Not as a Japanese, obviously, as a foreigner working and living in a society that I wish I understood better, but respect to the extent that I can understand it.
From Okinawa, how have you made...
Okinawa was just my introduction to what at the time I thought was Japan. It's actually a fairly different place than mainland Japan. But when I finished my active duty term down there and got into the reserves, went to law school and began to look at Japan as a whole, and became very interested in it. And after law school and my clerkship, came out to Japan and happened to interview for a few jobs out here and got one. And that's really what deflected my professional life to Japan. I was trained in U.S. litigation practice, but came out here interested in Japan, and after working in the international commercial environment for 3 years, decided that that's what I wanted to do, no matter where I was. And even when I went back to the U.S., that was my focus, until the law changed and I came back out again in 1990, and I've been here ever since.
I wonder if your military background, experience, have any influence on your view of the system of law.
I'm not sure so much on this. I haven't really thought about the system of law. The system of law is unrelated to the military. I think the military experience makes you, in your practice, a little more sensitive to the importance of practicality as well as principle, and trying to find ways to do things within the legal structure that satisfy the objectives of both sides, whether it's litigation or whether it's transactional. Certainly understanding that, and I certainly learned that in the military, understanding that nobody's going to have everything that they want, and they're not going to achieve that without taking casualties. It's a percentage game. Life is a percentage game. Clean wins are not an option usually.
Well, that metaphor is No, it's very graphic. I would think in my head, it's
You know,
use those words.
Yeah.
But really describes, I think, one of the causes of a lot of the dissatisfaction in what I perceive as the next generation.
Well, certainly, I would say that my perception is that there's an awful lot of noise on the fringe everywhere, whether you're left or right, whether you're in the United States or in Europe or even here. You know, the noisiest elements of society are on the fringes, and a lot of the noise seems to demand a 100% to zero solution, where the bulk of society, and I think the weight of common sense is that we have to find a way somewhere in the middle and accommodate the thought processes of those fringes, their values, the values they hold most dear, but we all have to do it together. And you know, one at the expense of complete elimination of the other is not practical. It's unrealistic.
It feels such a, I mean, I suppose in a lot of, in legal and in military, it's winning and losing is a lot about.
Well, in both those areas, it's invariably perceived as a fight to the death, one way or the other.
Yes.
But that's rarely how it ends. It rarely ends that way in litigation or transactional law, and it rarely ends that way in military conflict. Normally, it stops short of extermination, and
thank God
it lands somewhere at accommodation, somewhere between a 50-50 truce and a gracious victory.
I think that is wisdom. There, I really think so.
I don't know that it's wisdom. It's certainly it's rational. I think it's practical.
How would a person being fed with all the noise on social media or even official news channel nowadays learn? I don't think like listen to this channel versus that one. I think it's a hard call, but as an individual, how do we cultivate the skill to tell truth from noise?
I don't know exactly. I'm not extensively on social media. I do listen to a variety of podcasts, which I think have value, because it's not just a sound bite, it's an entire conversation that you're sitting in on. And what I try and do is I try to avoid making that a Greek chorus that reinforces my own views. I try to mix it up. You know, on my cell phone, I have the New York Times, I have Fox News, I have the BBC, and I try to triangulate between them, because I think all of them have BBC's the least of them, but I think they have all become apologists for one position or another. And I think it was Franz Kafka who said, you know, you do a comparison of lies to find the truth. And I think in today's polarized environment, you have to listen to the lies of both sides and try and find the truth.
That's also an amazing advice. so often to take one lie as truth and the other as lie.
Yeah, or information and disinformation. Well, actually, it's all disinformation to a degree, and I think you need to be selective in your filters, but you don't want to filter everything. I think you want to listen to the best of the position that you don't feel particularly comfortable with, and understand it. Try to understand it, so that you can engage with it intelligently instead of just shouting it down.
I mean, it's uncomfortable to listen to.
Of course it is. Of course it is.
And like push-ups or like any carrying heavy things or whatever, people kind of.
It's intellectual exercise.
It's intellectual exercise. What is the? I mean, people go to gym so that they can look fit, look good, and be.
It's resistance training,
right? For the brain, what kind of intellectual rewards can they gain from doing this exercise, in your opinion? Because why would people jump into that?
Well, I think the intellectual reward is in having confidence in the position that you're embracing, whatever it is. I think that you don't see it much from right to left, but I noticed that in the U.S., some of the most vocal people on the right are people who used to be on the left. And what happens is, I think that at some point, or as a result of some event, there's a disillusionment with the position that they had embraced reflexively, as opposed to after careful consideration. And that disillusionment drives them completely to the other side. That's uncomfortable, having to change positions so dramatically, especially if you've been vocal on the other side and people are throwing up sound bites from years ago in your face as you embrace your new position. So I think the intellectual benefit is having some confidence that you understand why your position is what it is. And having it a little more solid, I think.
Well, that's also very succinctly said, I would say. I think many people do find it hard to take a position nowadays.
Yeah. I think certainly in the United States, which again, the one that I keep the closest eye on, I think that in addition to news media, left and right, having lost the plot in terms of informing as opposed to persuading, I think that higher education is failing. When I was in university was a forum for all ideas, regardless of how extreme or ridiculous they were. They're subject to examination by peers and to challenge. And you come out of there with the ability to think critically. Maybe has a little different meaning today than it did then, but to think critically was to be able to assess positions, identify strengths and weaknesses, and develop your own. I think that higher education in the U.S. has drifted away from that. In the UK too, to some extent. The concept of deplatforming people because you disagree with what they are going to say, or you think that causes you pain, fear, or discomfort. For me, pain, fear, and discomfort were always kind of physical concepts. If it wasn't cutting me or breaking my bones, then it wasn't really hurting me, and I should listen. Today, the physical aspects of pain and discomfort are giving way to the psychological aspects of it. And I think it tends to breed an intellectual weakness.
Coming to this very personal example, I do want to share with you something I didn't tell you last time when we met. I spent about a third of my life in the States for college and graduate school, and I worked in the States afterwards.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that.
And one of the reason why I decided to leave the States and move back to Asia was not Okinawa. I felt like I didn't want to pay the U.S. tax, and which a big portion goes to the military.
Well, okay.
Which that was my rationale then. So it says I did have a personal opinion of not particularly agreeing with U.S. military actions. Since you're bringing that topic, I do want to come out clean or come out of it.
I don't agree with every military action we've taken. And in the fullness of time, I certainly don't agree with what we did and the way we did it in Vietnam. I think we really missed a trick. But as a second lieutenant, it wasn't my job to question that. It was my job to make sure that whatever that policy was, right or wrong, was executed in a responsible way. You certainly don't have to agree with every action. That would be dangerous. You need to look at those, and if you disagree with them, go about changing them in the best way that you can. In your case, as a non-American, maybe it is to leave. As an American, it is to stay and vote.
Can you share an example of you really disagreeing with something, do it first, and then try to change it?
I think Vietnam is probably the best example of that. Clearly wrong. Clearly wrong. But again, I think you have to look at it in context. And we're really, it's very close in time to the end of World War II. It's even closer to Korea. It's in the middle of the Cold War, and so you can't judge those decisions by today's standard. You need to look at them in the context of the times in which they were made, and think about the experience, the life experience of the people who were 50 and 60 in those days that were making those decisions. People like Eisenhower, people like Kennedy, people like McNamara. McNamara was an Army Air Corps officer during World War II in Korea. And so his views about adversaries, about communism, about what works and the way war is waged, quite different maybe than views of people today. But he was, I believe, doing the best he could at that time, and certainly even during his life. At the end of his life, he had deep regrets. If you've ever read any of the things that he's written or watched the documentaries that he's made, deep regrets about what happened and the way it happened, to the point where I think it did psychological damage to him. I think you see it so much today, where people in the U.S. like Lincoln and Washington being reassessed against a DEI standard of today. Come on, is that fair? Would you want to be judged by whatever the standard is 100 years from now? I don't know. It seems to me you could only develop that kind of thinking in a bubble.
A bubble we sometimes can it has a term for what they call it, ideology. Or have you? I mean, the more was clear in terms of a professional life. Have you, with now your triangulation practice and trying to see the people with opposite opinion eye to eye, came to a ideological breakthrough where something I believed so strongly before, I no longer believe very strongly, other than the Vietnam. Having lived grew up in the States, now lived in Asia for 30 years.
I don't think that there has been anything that has moved my firmament, if you will, has shaken my world. But I think that over time, I've come to realize why, for example, I'm so comfortable in Japan. And why I think that as a practical matter, society here works better than society in the US. Because I think that in the US we probably tend to, certainly these days, overvalue individual perspective and what we think is liberty, and undervalue community in broad form. And I'm not talking about your tribe, your interest group, but society at large. You know, I think that that Japan is kind of in a sweet spot. You know, I think that that they've really embraced and benefited from the social changes that have occurred here over the last 75, 80 years. You know, I think that it's become a much more classically liberal, egalitarian society where there is broad general understanding of the necessity to occasionally put community ahead of self. And you know, I think that there's a lot that other countries could learn from Japan in that regard. Everybody talks about it as being insular. Actually, it's not. It's quite open, and it's quite tolerant, but it is rules-based. And for the most part, people respect the rules, and people who disrespect the rules have a rough go of it. And what I've found is, as I've lived my life, I'm quite comfortable with that. More comfortable than I thought growing up. And you know, I think that certainly in the West, and certainly in the United States, we've focused too much on self and too much on identity, group identity, as a divisive force, as opposed to group identity as a cohesive force. And that I think that's probably the big learning of my life. Again, I don't think that it's been cataclysmic. It hasn't been a jump shift of any type, but it's creeped into my consciousness over the last 30 or 40 years. And as I look back, I really feel it.
I went to school in California, and I always remember the grand scene of Grand Canyon, and tell myself the greatest wonders of the world are created by water, not earthquakes.
It's the slow erosion.
Yes, it's the slow erosion. So if you say there's no one big shake, that career-long of shaping.
I'm pretty eroded as Americans go.
Or carved into a wonderful balanced view of the world, perhaps.
It's funny.
I know you're also a grandfather. Without going on much longer, I'm curious, what is the core value that you're trying to teach to your grandchildren today?
Actually, I try to stay back from that, because I think that grandparents can overdo it. But I have shared my views of this with my son and my daughter-in-law, and I think that they're doing a great job of it. And one of the things that makes me happiest looking at my grandchildren is the fact that they are going as mixed race children to Japanese grammar school, not the international schools, and are being socialized in the Japanese model while being fully bicultural and bilingual. And I am very hopeful that will pay huge dividends in their life, because they recently went back to the U.S. on a home leave, and all of my brothers and sister-in-laws just have been calling me the last 2 or 3 weeks and raving about the kids, their attitudes and behavior and politeness and consideration and all of the things that have been bred into them by their parents and by Japanese grammar school. I think Japanese education has its limitations. I don't think it's great at critical thinking. But I think that, so I'm not sure that I would be happy to see them go to high school here, but I think that primary education is very tough to beat, because not only is it didactically rigorous and stays on schedule, but it's all of the cultural behaviors that are inculcated that are priceless. Consideration for others, cleaning up after yourself, working as a team. How can that be bad?
Thank you for your time. I think.
Thank you. It's gone quickly. Interesting discussion. You rarely stop and think about your life in perspective, and it's a good exercise.
Thank you. For me, it's very. As I said, I already had an opinion about how I made a particular decision of my own life, and when I met you, I thought this is an opportunity for me to see it from the other side.
I wish that I could say that it's all been part of a grand plan. It hasn't been. I remember I had an economics professor in college, a fairly famous guy who went on to serve in the Carter administration and was responsible for deregulating the airline industry. But his name was Fred Kahn, but he used to use the expression, the tyranny of small decisions. And I think that that's characterized my life. You think you're in charge, you're not. You're driven and guided by all of the little decisions that you make every day. And taken in aggregate, it's very difficult to change those. You have to hope that it works.
All the more necessary that we find a principle that we fall back to.
That you live on every day.
Yes.
Yeah, right. That's right. Exactly.
And I hope that, you did share a couple of principles that I find to be truly valuable. I hope that this is valuable also to the people who get to chance upon this interview.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeffery.
Okay.
Thank you.